Hey folks, International Master Casa Corla here, bring you another recap from the 2026 Fide Candidates Tournament in the open and women's sections. And this time we're in round 9, so we're actually past the halfway point. And it's been a really interesting tournament thus far. We have one guy in the open running away with it, Yavakir Sindarov. And then we had a 5-way tie for first in the women's section. So without further ado, let's get into these games. So the tournament leader, Sindarov, was up against Blue Bomb for the second time around, this time with the black pieces. If you recall, Blue Bomb actually drew his first game with Sindarov, and actually that was the only game, or one of the only games in the first half of the tournament that Sindarov actually didn't manage to win. So there were talks about the great Blue Bomb sweep going into the tournament, where he had this great record against a lot of the top players. Very small sample size, but now, he actually was one of the guys that actually was able to slow down Sindarov. So question was he going to be able to do it in this one as well? We have a very kind of standard Queen's Gambit decline position on the board, and I stop it here because it's actually a really interesting moment where the normal move was not played. Typically in the structure after Bishop F4, you'll see the move castles, and there have been well over 10,000 games from the structure. But instead, Sindarov played the very rare move d takes c4, and this actually has less than 100 games, and it's just another fresh position. And I want to actually compare it to another line that is kind of analogous to it, which is if you go back to the position before Bishop e7 and Bishop f4 is on the board, so the position right after Knight c3, there's actually this line with d takes c4. It's actually played yesterday against Anish with black. Prague played against Anish yesterday, where you played d takes e4, e4, b5 here, and then there's e5, knight d5, knight takes b5, knight b6, and this is the beginning of a very theoretical Vienna type of Queen's Gambit. The reason I'm comparing it is because now after bishop, if you have bishop e7 and bishop f4 included, now d takes c4 actually essentially doesn't make certain moves as useful. So you get e4 as normal, but now after b5, the main line without bishop f4 and bishop e7 is actually e5. And here it's just a bad move because the bishop is on f4. So knight d5 is a tempo hitting both the knight on c3 and the bishop on f4. And you don't really have time to take the pawn on b5. So it's a really interesting nuance because the way you'd normally play with the b5 break, you can't do. So instead here, Blue Bomb, thought for a little bit and played knight takes b5. And you have this position after bishop b4 check, bishop d2, takes on d2, knights then takes c2, castles, where it's already a very fresh position on the board where essentially black might still be in preparation. Sindarov has had great preparation, but white is for sure playing on his own. And it turns out the best move in this position is actually e5, it is maybe semi-obvious move attacking the knight, but the implications are really tricky because you're giving up the d5 square, and there's, it's just a complicated position where white is going to be a pawn up after knight d5, bishop takes c4, but the bishop is going to have the long diagonal. There might be a chance of playing c5 later. The knight's on a decent outpost. It's a really complicated position, but it's something that Matthias probably should have gone for. Instead, he took on c4, and after a6, knight c3, queen takes d4, black actually gets this really valuable central pawn, and Blue Bomb, still is on his own. Now, what happened next was really interesting. Blue Bomb, who is one of the most solid players out there, and all his white games in the first half of the tournament, basically took a safety-first approach. He actually played queen e2, not castling kingside here, and after queen e2, bishop e7, castled queenside. So instead of castling kingside, he castled queenside and said, I want to kill you today. And I respect the ambition because, you're trying to hit at the leader of the event. But it's an extremely risky choice because one pawn is already gone from basically the queenside pawn shelter. And there's a half-open file on the b file because these pawns are split. So it does allow black a very quick counterplay. And in a matter of almost 10 moves, black did just that. Remaneuvered the knight from f6 all the way to d6, which is great. Got an a5, and then even a4. And all of a sudden here, we got to a very critical position where black is totally killing it. The pawn storm here has not hit home at all. This king is completely naked now because now the B file is a completely open file after A4. And all Sindarov has to do is play a move that doesn't trade queens, that essentially keeps the queens on the board. You can do that by playing queen b7. That's the best way. And you actually threaten bishop takes a4. So if a move like h4 is played, bishop takes a4, bishop takes a4, and even c5 here is devastating, kicking the queen away, and eventually getting in with queen b2 check or rook takes a4. Or you could play the move, what else? Queen a6, just saying, you know what, I'm not going to trade queens, keep the queens on the board. The extra pawn that you have is an ugly doubled a pawn, and again, I have this open file to play with. What's not to like? Instead, Sindarov made one of his basically first big mistakes of this tournament, and he actually played bishop takes a4, and it was based upon a huge miscalculation or misevaluation of the position. Because essentially, after queen takes b6, c takes b6, this is essentially forced, and bishop b3, he actually said in the press conference that he'd seen this. He said that he saw this position, and he thought that after bishop takes b3, a takes c3, rook a2, he had real counterplay on the second rank, and the king is pretty exposed. And we've seen two pairs of rooks do real damage to a king in this tournament in multiple games. First one that comes to mind is the game Fide actually lost to Hikaru. But the difference is here, there's actually this very strong move, king b1. And it looks like this rook, unimpeded on the second rank is going to just wreak havoc, like with a move like rook f4, or sorry, rook f2 or rook e2, looking at rook f4, rook e4. But the problem is wherever the rook goes on the second rank, it can be chased away. Rook f1, rook e2, rook e1, rook d2, rook d1. And there's just no time to really corral the pawns here that are kind of sticking out like a sore thumb, in part because black has back rank issues. So if you go rook b d8, insisting on saying, I'm going to have this active rook on the second rank, the problem is there's actually king c1. And there's no way, again, to maintain the rook on the second rank because your other rook on d8 will be hanging. So essentially, because of that queen trade, the position totally fizzled out. And, essentially that was a huge half point that Sindarov basically spoiled because, again, the king on c1 was so wide open that, there were ways to make inroads in this position. And alas, it just didn't happen. So Blue Bomb was able to scrape away with a draw again. And, we had a situation where, the rook endgame, there wasn't anything going here. And Sindarov managed to get onto 7 out of 9, but could have easily won today, and then the tournament maybe would have been over. Instead, that gave an opportunity for other players to get a little bit closer, and that leads us to our next matchup, which was the game between Fabiano Caruana and Anish Giri. And this is probably the matchup of the day, given the tournament situation for both players. So going into this game, both players were on +1 on 4.5 out of 8. And you had a situation where they both need a win. So they were going to be ambitious here. And this is probably the critical position of the game, or one of the critical positions of the game, because essentially white has the center in this Italian, but black has the two bishops. And a lot of times here, when you're playing with white, you're trying to figure out the right way to advance and go forward and essentially kind of, jump in the center, complete your development and kind of press the position a little bit. And I think Fabi made a decision he normally wouldn't make because of the tournament situation. Anish has a very healthy position. He's made inroads on the queen side with a4. These bishops are controlling some squares, particularly this light squared bishop. But the problem is this dark square bishop is a little restricted right now because of the pawn center. And in many situations, you have to be very careful about whether to take and actually give white a totally unimpeded center. But there is a little bit of a threat here. And the threat is that if you give black a moment, like let's say you play a move like a3, in some positions, e takes d4 is actually great because after e takes d4, c takes d4, the d5 break works now. And normally this break is not very good because it allows white to kind of pass like ships in the night. But this undermining move f6 is actually really excellent, challenging the center. And after a move like e takes f6, queen takes f6, the knight on g6 is an excellent piece, could potentially jump to f4 later. There's a rook that's really, really good now in the half-open f-file. And even the d4 pawn can be a target later in the game. So I think Fabiano saw this kind of nebulous threat with e takes d4 and d5, and he decided to do something radical that's not in the spirit of the position, but it's because of the tournament situation. And he played this move d5. Now again, bishop e3 was readily available, but there is this nice simplifying maneuver, take on d4 and playing d5, that I think he was wary of. And so again, d5 was played. And this move is really bad because you essentially allow this dark square bishop to actually have a very clear target towards the white king. But also now, any type of pawn breaks later in the game with f5 are going to be much easier because there's no pressure on e5. So black moves the bishop away and all of a sudden has clear strategic aims to potentially undermine with c6 or undermine with f5, and maintains the two bishops in a position that's less flexible for white. A lot of times the point of the center is that it's actually quite flexible. So we have a ton more moves, and eventually the bishop does land on e3 to challenge the bishop on a7, and then another uncharacteristic decision is made because after bishop takes f3, Fabiano plays the best but very ugly f takes e3. And the point is he's actually trying to stop f5. If you take with the queen, you know, you're actually allowing this f5 break because there's no pressure on f5 here. And if you take with the rook, f5 temporarily is not good, but knight f4 is going to force the queen to move off this diagonal eventually, and then the f5 break will be on the cards. And so essentially, in order to stop f5, he really decides to spoil his structure in an ugly way, and this gives black all of the long-term trumps. And essentially, the rest of the game is about black trying to figure out how to execute his break effectively. So we're going to zip through a ton of the game here, but you can see it's really one-way traffic for most of the game. So first, Giri improves on the queen side. He gets in b5. Then he eventually takes the a file with the rook landing on a3. And what this means is that black can actually aim to double. And so then he doubles rooks on the a file and manages to do that. Then he triples on the a file, Alekhine gun, and you know, shuffles a little bit because they're getting close to the time control. Then he sees this pawn e4 is weak, so he maneuvers his bishop to g6 to make this pawn a massive target. And meanwhile, you can see white has been fledgling most of the game. The only chance Fabiano had was right before the time control, because in this position, Anish played the move c5, trying to fix all of the pawns on light squares. And it turns out here that d takes c6 was a really good move. The point is that after queen takes c6, knight c2, white actually has a target on b4 to work with. And even though there's some trades here, it actually turns out that white has excellent drawing chances after knight d5, severing the connection of the queen and bishop. And there are endgames where all of a sudden the c pawn, even though it's, you know, white has less pawns, white has the furthest advanced pawn, and that is distracting enough that it gives white counterplay to draw. But again, it was not Fabiano's day, and he did not play the move d takes c6, did not play en passant, and instead decided to remain passive. And this led to a very beautiful finish, which was the queen played queen a7, queen b1, h5, king f3, h4, and then in this very, very critical position with the queen on d3, the knight on a1, these pieces really super as passive as they can get. Anish found the brilliant f5 check, which actually forced a resignation in a move, because after e takes f5, king h6 sealed the deal. And it's a really beautiful pattern, because the point is that if you play f takes g6, e4 actually takes away the escape squares for white going back back home. And so after the queen moves, queen g5 is actually checkmate. Incredible stuff. And also after king h6, if you let's say if you play like f3, king f3, trying to run away before e4 is played, well, you have e4 check anyway, because after queen takes e4, bishop h5 check forces the king to make a decision to protect the queen still. And after king f4, queen g5 is mate. And after g4, en passant check is actually going to have the same problem, where the king either gets mated or it loses connection to the queen on e4. So, if you looked at this game, you'd say, well, dominating performance from Anish, and it was, and you'd say, well, Fabiano, he just really didn't know what he was doing today. But I think a lot of the way the game went was characterized by decisions early in the opening or early middle game dictated by Fabiano's desire to win. He basically showed himself a little bit too much in a position that did not warrant some of the things he did. And unfortunately, this is 2 losses in a row for Fabiano, and this tournament is virtually over. He is now 2.5 points behind Sindarov with 5 games to go, and yeah, that's just not going to happen. And he was obviously dejected after the game, and it's tough because it's a he had chances going to the second half, and in 2 rounds those chances have completely evaporated. Meanwhile, Anish Giri is now on +2, having won 2 games in a row, and he is a 1.5 behind Sindarov with 5 games to go, which is still very challenging. But he has a head-to-head with Sindarov with white in a few rounds, or actually in the later rounds of the event. And, he still has things to play for. So now it's a 2-horse race between Anish and Sindarov, and, we'll see where it goes. The other games did end peacefully today in the open section, but we're going to look at snapshots from them because that didn't mean there weren't chances. And this game in particular from Prague, he was white against Wei and had a massive chance before the time control to just win the game. And I'm shocked he missed this one. It's really indicative that this event has not been his way because he lost to Anish yesterday and now has a golden chance today. And it is white to move. And you might be wondering, isn't there a free bishop on c8? And the answer is yes, there is. And Prague didn't take it. Now, the reason he didn't take it, I understand, but I don't agree with, obviously, but it's also surprising that he wasn't able to calculate this. Now, the point is that, however you take on c8, there is some issue with the pawn on f4, and the king is a little exposed. And so you play knight takes c8, black is a piece down and has to try to get a perpetual. So they'll play rook takes c8. And after rook takes c8, queen takes f4 check, it looks on the surface like there might be a perpetual because king h1, queen f1 actually does look like a repetition. But the king can run. And so after queen takes f4 check, you can go king g1 and run towards the queen side. And eventually this king is actually going to be safe. And I think the thing that might have been missed is that once the king does get to b1, you can bring the rook back and block. So after rook c2 check, queen d1, rook c1, queen d3 check, now the king actually can go to a1. And then once the king's on the a file, then the queen on e7 can block, and then there are no checks. So I'm guessing one of the defensive blocking moves, whether it's rook c1 or queen a3, might have been missed in time trouble. But that was a free piece, simply put. The bishop on c8 was hanging. Now, a few moves later, actually, queen c7 was played b5. And now, again, the bishop is still hanging, and you need just 1 or 2 moves to secure it. And you can play the move rook c2 here. And the rook on c2 now does not defend the pawn f4, but it does attack the queen. And after queen takes f4 check, you could block with g3, and there are no more checks because, the queen f2 is covered, everything else is covered, and now the c8 bishop can be captured. And again, this would be a piece-up position, completely winning. Instead, after b5, Prague went for rook e4, and after more drama, it's still actually winning. But after more drama after the control, somehow, some way, it was all thrown away, and Prague wound up having to actually take a draw in this game later on. This is the last chance, and this is a hard move to make. b4 actually wins here, shutting off the bishop's diagonal. The point is that if you play queen takes b4, now queen c2 wins, and the point is actually king h8, knight f7 is pretty. I'll show that. But this is a much more difficult sequence than the other ones where the bishop on c8 was clearly hanging in. Not Prague's tournament. So this game ended in a draw, and, both of these guys, Wei and Prague, are both on 4 out of 9 on -1. The last game actually was a really good endgame kind of study position because White's a pawn up, and it is a decent extra pawn. Like, if it was on the A file, I'd be more pessimistic, but on the B file, it's actually a pretty good pawn. And it was actually black to move here, and I was certain during the game that I would see the rook go behind the pawn. Everything I've learned about rook endgames over the years tells me you go rook c1, king g2, and rook b1, and you get the rook behind the pawn, and that's the defensive posture you want. Because once you're behind the pawn, you can also pressure the pawns on the king side horizontally. So this position, I think, would be a theoretical draw with best play, and simple enough. Strangely, to my eyes, I really did not understand this in the moment. Andrei Yesipenko played, to me, a very perplexing move, rook b6. And rook in front of the pawn is not the defensive posture I think would make sense, but it actually does hold with very exacting moves. And Andrei got it right in a very, I would argue, somewhat inhuman way, or at least very difficult computerish way, because now you actually do allow White's king to mosey over and try to get to the b pawn. But it's a question about whether you have enough counterplay on the king side to offset White's march to the queen side. Now it turns out you do. So rook e3 defends the b pawn, and now f6 was played, and this is the key move. The key move is actually to play g5 eventually, and to try to break up White's kingside pawn so that you can get some counterplay. And it's a really tricky move to appreciate, because here's my take. If you play f5, you're actually going to lose. And the reason you're going to lose is because after f4, the black king is cut. You can see the rook on the e file is just covering the e file completely. And now there's no pawn breaks to get at White's pawn structure, and this king work is going to run over to the queen side and support the advance of the pawn. This is an easy win, but with f6 it's a different story. And what happens is f4 was played, g5 was played, undermining the structure. And one of the things I was wondering from afar was, isn't this still a close to winning position for White? Why is this a draw? Because if Black actually trades the h pawns, or the h pawn for the g pawn, this is completely winning. The king will now support the pawn, and this king will be cut, and White's rook can also support the advance of the pawn. But strangely enough, in this position after king d2, there's one drawing move, and the one drawing move is remarkably rook b8. Not rook b5, not rook b7, but rook b8. And the point is that after rook b8, as the king approaches the pawn and tries to advance it, Black gives checks and makes sure that never happens. And so rook c8 check happened, king b2 going back, rook b8 check, and it doesn't work. And the thing is, if the king goes to d4, you give a check on d8. King c5, you give a check on c8. King b6, you give a check on b8. And the point is, you make sure that pawn never gets pushed to b4, and then you ensure the draw. Now, the thing that's so amazing about this way of defending is if you don't play rook b8, you lose. And I want to show you why rook b7 loses, because it looks so similar to rook b8. And the point is that after king c3, rook c7 check, you begin the checks now. What happens is that the king actually approaches the rook and runs out of real estate. The black rook does. And so now after rook c8, b4 does wind up happening. And yeah, you can give a few ring around the rosy checks, but ultimately the rook gets behind the b pawn, and then it just advances, and it's a completely winning position. And so just that little detail, the two little details, playing f6 and playing rook b8 at the right moment when the king runs over to the queen side, is enough to hold, but it would not be the way I would recommend it. I would strongly recommend put the rook behind the pawn, and that's the way you ought to do it. But Yesipenko found another way, and he held the game. So at the state of play in the open section, it is still Sindarov in the lead, but his lead was cut by half a point. He is now has 7 out of 9. Anish has 5.5 out of 9, and it's going to be a 2-horse race going into the last 5 rounds. All right, so women's section was crazy. We had 5 players tied going into on 4.5 out of 8 going into this round because unfortunately Anna Muzichuk collapsed yesterday and managed to have all these people catch her. And so now it's a question of who could get separation and potentially get to 5.5. And the first player that answered that question was Vaishali in a all Indian matchup. Vaishali versus Divya Deshmukh. Both were on 4.5 out of 8 trying to win. And in this very, very messy and complicated position, Vaishali found the brilliant rook takes d3. It's a really excellent exchange sacrifice that does two things. One, it gets rid of this knight that's a real thorn in the position right now. Two, it opens up the light squared bishop, which now has a really, really nice long diagonal to work with. And C, it actually helps mobilize the advance of white's central pawns, because now after the exchange sacrifice, you could play c5, and this is just a really dangerous pawn roller that you can't really deal with. Divya tried to sack an exchange, but the pawns are still dangerous, and after a few more moves, the pawns wind up deciding the game. Divya actually resigned after rook b7 because c7, c8 is going to happen, and bishop takes b7, c takes b7 does not change very much at all. There will be a second queen on the board, and that's more than enough for white's position. So Vaishali does get to 5.5 out of 9. Really nice, comeback on her behalf because she did start through 5 rounds on -1, and now she's won 3.5 out of her last 4 games. So she's really now, has the momentum, and she was the second half star of the last candidates. If you recall, she won 5 games in a row to finish the last candidates tournament, but did not come in first because of such a poor start. She's now rolling and in first place, so very, very promising situation for Vaishali. The next matchup of players on 4.5 out of 9 featured Katerina Lachno and Zhu Jinner. And Katerina has had a very up and down tournament, Zhu Jinner as well, and now they both had a chance to get some separation. And in this position, Black just played f takes e5 and has the bishop pair in what looks like an imposing center. But there are some weaknesses, and Zhu Jinner exploits them really nicely with e4. And essentially what she was able to do is try to seize upon some of the light squares, the weak light squares in Black's camp. Now, the best move here turns out to be d4, and you are giving up some light squares here, but at least you have a protected pass pawn on d4 wherever the knight goes. But instead, Lachno actually played the really perplexing move d takes e4. And now after bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, we have the contours of a Swiss cheese structure where we're going to have a good knight versus bad bishop situation, and it's going to be tough to deal with, and it turned out to be too tough to deal with. The pieces got traded, but the boots on the ground were the same, and she won 1 pawn, then she won a second pawn, and ultimately went on to win the game. And so Zhu Jinner did manage to get to 5.5. Lachno again bounces back down to 50%. She keeps going from +1 to 50%. And she joined Vaishali on 5.5. Next game was a question of whether Anna could get to 5.5 and recover from yesterday, and she had a great chance to do so because Tan Zhengyi has been struggling the whole tournament, unfortunately. And in this position, Anna has a pawn up, active king, really healthy position, but the h7 pawn is attacked. Now, it's not very easy to deal with that pawn and defend it, so you have to kind of go active. And the best way to do that would actually be to go f takes g5, and king f5, and say, you know what, I don't care about the h7 pawn, but after rook takes h7, I actually don't care about the g5 pawn either. And I think this maybe was why she didn't go for it, because king takes g5, bishop h4 check looks quite drawish with the material still being equal. But it turns out that here, the winning move is actually bishop g8, hitting the rook on h7, and now threatening rook d1. And those combined threats are actually surprisingly dangerous. If rook g7, you have rook d1 check, bishop d5 check, rook d3 check, and e5. And all of a sudden, the combined threats of the rook hitting c3, of bishop g2, rook h3 mate, and of maybe even moseying the e-pawn down the board are too much for black to handle, or for white to handle, and black is winning here. Instead, Anna played the move rook b7, and it does look sensible, trying to activate with rook b1. You also it's essentially a checkmating threat that would force white to block with the bishop. But Tan found the very precise bishop c5, giving the king a way in, and also looking at the e7 pawn. And after king f5, rook takes h7. The difference here is that a lot of pawns have been traded, and you haven't made those inroads like you would have in the other position. The last real opportunity was actually to not trade rooks. I think Anna actually thought the position with the rooks off the board and a pawn up was actually, close to winning. But it turns out that this pawn up opposite colored bishop endgame is actually a draw, even under the right circumstances where you lose the h-pawn. And Tan found those circumstances. We eventually had a position where, black does win the h-pawn, but the problem is by winning the h-pawn, she actually had to put her pawns on light squares, and that enabled white to easily establish a dark square blockade. And if you are down, if you're down a few pawns, but you have opposite colored bishops on the board, you have a chance to blockade, and this is a dead draw. Point being that the bishop holds g3, and if you ever go something like king d3, let's say, then the bishop will hold c3, and you just can't make progress. Even if you run your, king to a4, it just is not going to work. And this king will hold down these two pawns. So heartbreaker for Anna. She was winning yesterday. She was winning today. She's gotten a half point from those games, and she's now a half point behind Vaishali and Zhu Jinner with 5 rounds to go, and needs to try and seize the momentum she's lost. But she is fully capable of doing so, and we'll see what happens in the next several rounds. The last game of the day featured 2 players that weren't vying for first place at the moment, but were very close behind, and both had 4 out of 9 going into the round. 4 out of 8, rather. They're both on 50%. Sorry, they had 3.5 out of 8. I'm essentially foreshadowing here. They did get to 4.5 out of 9. This game did end in a draw. And it's funny because I was watching the commentary of Peter Svidler and Jan Gustafsson on the live Fide channel, and both of them had a hard time. They saw that black was actually fine according to the eval bar, but they had a hard time understanding why that was the case. White is a pawn up. It's a doubled pawn, but it is a pawn. And the bishops actually aren't terrible. It looks like the bishop on e4 can be captured, but if you take that bishop, you fix white's pawn structure. And it looks like the bishop on e3 isn't that bad either. And it's hard to develop because if you move the bishop on c8, the b7 pawn hangs, and you can't push the b pawn because the rook on a8 is hanging. So the question was, how do you solve these problems? How do you get your rooks connected? How do you proceed? And the answer was knight g4. And the point is, you just get rid of one of the bishops. The queen and the knight are hitting h2, threatening checkmate, and the bishop on e3 is hit. So there are certain positions where the bishop pair might be of value, but you don't rush it. So g3 was played, trying to, essentially stop the mate. And then queen a5, very precise move, not actually taking on e3, threatens queen h5, and you're trying to actually soften up the white king side a little bit more while threatening mate. And Alexandra thought this was enough of a pressure that she decided to try and trade queens. But after the queen trade, you don't even have to take the knight on e3, the bishop on e3 anymore at the knight, because you actually do secure the d pawn. And it turned out that white was actually, a little bit worse in this position, having recovered the pawn, having a weak d pawn and b pawn. But Grechka would go on to hold this game, and relatively easy fashion. And we wound up having a move repetition right before move 40 that satisfied both players. So Bibisara and Goretzka are both on 4 out of 9. They are a point and a half behind the leaders. That's Vaishali and Zhu Jinner, but we still have a very, very, packed standings there. You got basically 5 players that are within a point of of the leader, and yeah, everything to play for in the next 5 rounds. Going to be very, very exciting. So yeah, there will be more chess to be played, and we'll see what round 10 brings. So stay tuned with me, and I'll bring you more recaps soon. Peace.